This is episode 185. I'm Tommy Serafinsky, and you're listening to the Conservation and Science podcast. And in case you're new here, in this podcast, we take a deep dive into topics of ecology, conservation, and human-wildlife interactions. And I always strive to bring you diverse, or at least balanced, perspectives on every environmental story and examine their ecological, social, and political dimensions. And folks, today our guest is environmental social scientist, Dr. Jonny Hanson. And as you will hear in the podcast, Jonny was on my radar for quite a while. He does a lot of excellent work that I follow for a long time. And recently he wrote a report titled Large Carnivore Reintroductions to Britain and Ireland, Farmers' Perspectives and Management Options. And when I read the title of this report, I go like, yes, that is the one. I gotta have Jonny on the podcast. And so here's the episode that you're going to listen in a second. If you want to read the report or article that Jonny wrote for Irish Examiner, in the description of this podcast, there's a link to the public version of my newsletter. My newsletter is usually not public, it's not being published online, but I make an exception for this episode. So go in there, you will have the link to this particular issue of my newsletter, where you can find a link to the report and you can find a link to the article. Now, if you like this newsletter, if you like what you see there, don't forget to subscribe. And from that now on, you'll be getting this newsletter straight to your inbox. And that's also a great way to get in touch with me, because all you need to do is hit the reply button and that email will get straight to my inbox. Now, back to the episode. In the episode, we're mainly going to discuss whether large carnivore conservation can coexist with livestock farming. That's the top level question. We're going to talk about how to balance conservation goals with the realities of modern agriculture. And Jonny has absolutely vast knowledge about coexistence with large carnivores and the problems they cause or may cause to farmers. And his experiences across the world in the US, in Nepal, and also much closer to home in Europe. And also does research on this stuff in island of Britain and island of Ireland. So incredibly interesting episode and incredibly interesting conversation with my guest, Jonny Hanson. So I'm not going to drag this introduction any longer. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonny Hanson. Jonny Hanson, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tommy. It's good to be on the program. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And like we spoke a little bit before we started recording, you were on my radar for some time now, and it turns out that I was on your radar as well. So it's great to finally get connected.
Absolutely. A little bit of serendipity there. So,
Jonny, we may know who we are, but I presume that some of my listeners might not know who you are. So I'm just going to say that you wrote the report called Large Carnivore Reintroductions to Britain and Ireland, Farmers' Perspectives and Management Options. So can you give us a little bit of the introduction, who you are, what you do, and how did it happen that you wrote that report?
Sure. So I'm an environmental social scientist. So I don't study the environment per se. I study our relationship with the environment. And of all the relationships that we have with the world around us, the one that interests me most is our relationship with large carnivores, who are a flesh and blood species that wander the landscapes of the world around us, but they're also symbolic species that wander the landscapes of the world within us. And that makes them incredibly charismatic and inspiring, but it also makes them problematic because we have different perspectives on these species. And I previously did a lot of work on this with snow leopards in Nepal. But as I was writing my PhD on snow leopard conservation in Nepal and how it could coexist with livestock farmers there, the Lynx UK Trust were starting to talk about lynx reintroductions to the north of England, and they had a proposal they were developing. And that was eventually declined in large part because of a lack of consultation with farmers, which I agreed with. I didn't think there was enough consultation. And in that moment, this was about 8 years ago, I thought, if I ever get the opportunity to research this topic and to look at farmers' perspectives on this topic, and take my lessons from Nepal and bring them to Britain and Ireland, my two native islands, that is something that I would love to do. After my PhD, I also, instead of doing the typical academic thing, which is do more research and then more research and just keep going on the hamster wheel of research, I set up and ran Northern Ireland's first community-owned farm. And so every day was a research day. Every day was a school day. Every day I was making mistakes. Some days I was succeeding, probably a bit like your podcasting journey. And at the center of that, again, was this relationship between people and nature, and particularly between agriculture and conservation. Can we find ways to reconcile them? And are there places where there are trade-offs between them? So at the end of that project, having handed over to a new management team in 2022, large carnivores, one of my great loves in life, were calling my name again. But I wanted to take all my learning from being a farmer and all my learning from being a large carnivore conservationist and bring those two things together. And this report is the combination of that journey.
The report, when I saw the title of the report, I go like, yes, that's exactly it. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came about write that report and what was the methodology?
Part of it was funded by a Nuffield farming scholarship. So Nuffield farming scholarships, they're in about 10 different countries, including Ireland. The Northern Nuffield scholars go through the UK system. So I'm a UK Nuffield farming scholar. And part of that is a program of leadership development for those working in agriculture and rural sectors, rural development, that sort of thing. Part of it is also taking a topic and researching it in depth through both typical approaches to research or reading literature, but also through travel internationally. So what I did was divide my methodology into two parts. I did interviews with farming and rewilding leaders across both Britain and Ireland. So all of the 5 main farming unions, 2 livestock organisations, and then for balance, 3 rewilding organisations. And those were all interviews or one focus group. And again, the same sort of questions on how would we manage this? How would we govern it? What are your perspectives generally on this topic? The second part of the methodology then was international travel. So I had 3 main countries. One was Switzerland, one was the Netherlands, and then I traveled across the USA's Mountain West, so Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. And there it was very much, yes, having interviews and asking similar questions, but getting out of the Zoom room or the Google Meets room and into the field. So I was having those interviews and also observing people on ranches, in national parks, in coffee shops, and also people from all walks of life. So hunters and farmers and ranchers and rewilders, conservationists, bureaucrats, government officials, everybody in between. So in total, 56 interviews across 7 countries, which really helped me to get under the skin of this topic and get into the nuance and the complexity of coexistence.
Why you thought that farmer's perspective, like why the farmer's perspective was the focus of it?
I think strategically, when it comes to living alongside large carnivores, they often occupy large habitats, large home ranges, and often protected areas like national parks and nature reserves are not sufficient to contain them. And that means that the space that they need to occupy ranges widely, and that brings them into landscapes where people live. And in some places, including on the island of Ireland, also Nepal, where I've done work, you find people living in protected areas as well, and often farming as a means of deriving an income, or that long cultural association we have with ruminants and other livestock. So what that means for large carnivore conservation, for large carnivores to thrive on planet Earth, they need to share landscapes with livestock farming. And that is often the real crux of the issue. It's a crux of the issue in terms of large carnivores eating livestock, the actual numbers. But even, and this is going to be a recurring theme in our conversation, it's not so much something I've looked at in the report, but it will be in the book that's coming out early next year. There's the actual reality of, say, a farmer losing sheep to wolves in Nepal. And then there's the perception of that reality. And with these species, the perception I would argue is almost more significant than the reality. So whether it's perception or reality, this issue of can large carnivore conservation coexist with livestock farming is not just the crucial issue for large carnivore conservation across the planet, but if we want to even think seriously about reintroducing these animals to these islands and to Ireland specifically, then this is, for me, it is one of the big question, maybe the big question that needs to be answered. So that was why I wanted to bring, to help answer it, and to start answering it. I think it will be a process over the coming years and decades of answering.
Funny you mentioned that the perception is sometimes even more important than the reality, because I just had that discussion yesterday on Twitter or X Twitter with one of the conservationists. That exactly what does it matter? I think it was about bears and whether the bears getting more aggressive when they're not hunted. It's like, what does it matter? If the perception is they are, like, this is probably more important. So that it's funny that we talking about the same thing. So listen, let's jump right into it. What is perspective of farmers about large carnivores restoration or reintroduction, like some say?
Yeah, so I think they're not particularly keen would be the short version of it. But there's been a few studies, and in fact, there's been 2 out early this year that are the first studies that actually look at farmers' perspectives. And they've used a quantitative methodology. So they've got bigger numbers of respondents, and farmers are, for example, there's a study in Britain, 60% of farmers said that they would shoot lynx that were reintroduced. But no one had really got into the quantitative data like that gives you breadth. But I wanted to do a qualitative study that gave you depth, that really dove deeply into the topic. And so it wasn't just wanting to understand what are your perspectives, which I assumed in advance were negative, and my study confirmed that. I wanted to understand why they were negative. What was the nuance going on here? And what I did then, and what came out in the study, was this categorization of people's perspectives across different categories. So it wasn't just that people were negative. They were negative because there were social issues, there were political, there were legal, there were economic, technical. There was a whole bunch of different categories that would explain the factors that were going on and the context in which this reintroduction coexistence would be considered. And that's really important because, and we'll get on to maybe the more technical issues in a while, often coexistence can be boiled down to, do we have livestock guardian dogs or do we have livestock guardian donkeys? Do we have electric fencing or do we have fencing with fladry, which is like colored tape that flutters in the wind? We need to take a step back from that and think about, firstly, governance, which is what are the mechanisms that allow for this to be governed? That allow different stakeholders to have opinions, sometimes very different opinions on this issue. But what this study showed to me is that we need to take a step back again before we even get to governance and understand what is going on in rural areas and in the broader agri-environmental sector. So, for example, one of the things, obviously, post-Brexit, especially in the UK, but I think there's a spillover into the island of Ireland through Northern Ireland, and generally it is uncertainty about what the future of agri-environmental schemes are going to be, and funding streams across both of these islands. So that's one of the big issues that kept coming up in conversations, just this environment of instability for farmers, where margins are squeezed, trade deals are on the cards, there is uncertainty about the future. And so I think for any of us, thinking about what we use to pay the bills and our career, our livelihood, if there was something, and maybe Brexit is a good example here again as well, something like that threatens to upend the apple cart or to change our daily routine or what we're familiar with, most of us are not going to embrace that with open arms. Some of us here maybe more risk tolerant will. So I think for me, that was one of the big take homes, was just thinking about the context. And it is quite an uncertain context at the moment for farmers. And that was one of the big things that came out.
I can add one more to that from my conversations with farmers, where I was digging into why farmers seem to be the only group who are against nature restoration law recently passed in the EU. And I think it's obviously it's more complex than that, but if I were to boil down to one sentence, is because farmers feel like they were screwed over so many times that they just don't believe in any promises and anything that is said that what it's going to be, which is a little bit along the lines what you're saying is like this environment is like certain levels of volatility, I guess, for farmers, and mistrust,
volatility. Those are spot on. Those are words that I would lift out of the mouths of many of the people I interviewed, and not just a mistrust of politicians, but also a certain mistrust of conservation NGOs. It would likely be the ones actually running these projects. And one of the key things in both of those cases was about the timescales involved. So some of my interviewees, one in particular, said these projects tend to run in 5-year cycles. Politicians are elected in 5-year cycles. We're on the land for generations. So what happens in 5 years when the politicians change, the project comes to an end, the population of, say, lynx is increasing, sheep losses are also increasing. What is the funding mechanism for that? And those are, I think, valid concerns. And there's still a lot of unanswered questions there about the long-term financing of, for example, compensation schemes or insurance schemes over not just 5 years, but 10 years, 50 years. We need to be thinking long-term as well. So my reason and interest in writing this report, and overall I'm neutral on this topic on the balance of it. These valid concerns are not to say that this cannot happen, but actually it is for those who do want large carnivore reintroductions. I think it raises the bar and says, here are the mainly valid concerns of farmers. What, for those who do wish to seriously think about reintroducing these animals, what now? How do we respond to these concerns? What mechanisms do we put in place? What policy, what management, what governance frameworks? And that's some of the recommendations in the report that we'll maybe talk about later.
Just wondering, when I was reading the report, it refers to farmers. And like, if there's like a one thing I learned about farmers is that farmers are not homogeneous group. There are no such thing as farmers.
But nor conservationists either.
No, the conservationists, nor the this is, you see, this is the problem. I increasingly I'm speaking about those things like every day, well, every week, and I increasingly don't know how to talk about them anymore because like, who are the farmers? So I am curious, like, how you dealt with that issue, because, for example, I know of a farmer who asked the question along the lines, am I the only farmer who would like to see lynx or wolves despite the losses? And then the conversation went in, and then it turned out that he was on the some consultation panel, and he voted against. And like, why did you vote against? Because of the peer pressure. Because then he would be ostracized. Because then, like, oh, you're like, and so again, there's like this complex picture that not only the group as farmers is not homogeneous, and there's like all plethora of attitudes, approaches, concerns, and so on, but also some of them might not be actually telling the truth because of, the need to fit in and not be, this odd one out, right? So how did you deal with that in your report?
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. And that phenomena where individual perspectives are reinforced by groups, by the social dynamics of groups. And before I get into fully answering that, there was a study I remember that I looked at in Namibia, and I was looking at farmers' perspectives on coexisting with different large carnivore species there. And when the scientists looked at those perspectives individually, there were, like you were saying, individuals who are much more willing to compromise, much more open to it. But when she, I think, then reran it as focus groups and people were in a room with their peers talking about the same issue, the perspectives were much more siloed, much more caricatured and stereotyped and maybe hard lines. So that is an issue that we need to be aware of. In this case, I think it's something that's going to need a lot more research. It was a bit beyond the scope of this study, in that with my British and Irish interviewees, I wanted to get a sample of farming leaders, and the farming unions are the industry leaders across both Britain and Ireland. So, and also I was able to get access to interview them. And so just practically those were the best and easiest ones. But do the farming unions represent the perspectives of all farmers on this island or in Britain? Absolutely not. They don't. I think we could say there's a certain amount of breadth where they represent a broad spectrum of farmers, but within that you will have many different perspectives, as you've alluded to. And then, of course, outside of that, you will have non-members who are even more opposed, and also those like the individual you're talking to who might be in favour. So that's definitely an issue. In some of the interviews, I didn't really didn't make it into the final cut of the report, but I did talk a bit about, for example, how different types of farmers might perceive large carnivore reintroductions. So if you're a sheep farmer or a goat farmer to a lesser extent, your animals are very vulnerable to lynx and to wolves. If you're a cattle farmer, your animals are not vulnerable to lynx. There's some vulnerability to wolves, especially of calves, and especially if you have, for example, when I was in Switzerland, in parts of Switzerland where you have lower populations of sheep and lower populations of deer, wolves are learning, as they've learned in Yellowstone to move from elk to bison. They've learned in Switzerland to now start hunting cattle, which is causing all sort of problems. So there's differences there. And then thirdly, if you're an arable farmer and you're farming barley or rye or something, and you have a problem with deer who are eating your crops, you actually might be much more open to the idea of an animal that is going to control reduce the deer numbers and maybe scare them away, change their behavior and make them more fearful and staying away from your cereal fields. So
I want that pack of wolves on my field now.
So yeah, somebody call them, get me the 999 and get the deer police on the line. If only it were that simple. If only it were that simple. But you're absolutely right. Thinking of the again, the nuance, even within farmers' perspectives. Farming is a very broad church, and there are going to be very broad perspectives. And that is something I think that needs to be investigated further in the future.
So we established, as expected, I think it's not a surprise that the farmers mainly are, let's say, not stoked about the idea, but they were some common grounds. What were the common grounds between farming and, let's use this umbrella term, rewilding or reintroducers?
Reintroducers, yeah. Yeah, the main area of common ground. First, I talked about the different management options. So we have a suite of 5 different tools which we can use to facilitate coexistence, what I call the coexistence toolkit. And 4 of those are management, so deterrence methods, financial methods, enterprise methods, and the use of force. And perhaps we'll get into that a little bit more in a while. But sitting underneath that, the foundation on which those management approaches sit is governance. And governance is mechanisms, procedures, it's policies, guidelines, stakeholder discussion groups, conflict resolution mechanisms. It all sounds fantastically boring, and yet it is fantastically important. It is perhaps the most important part of this process, because what it does is allows for different perspectives to conflict and compete and ideally find some sort of compromise or common ground and find ways and agree on boundaries within which a process such as a reintroduction happens, how you deal with conflict, how you manage it at a high level. And the common ground was that was really important. So for both farmers and for rewilders alike, they all agreed that governance was important. So in terms of I think I called it in the report or in one of, maybe it was the Irish Examiner article, I called it a sliver of common ground. But that is an important sliver because governance is just crucial in conservation in general.
Yeah, well, I take even a sliver, right? It's always like, it's so important to start on where we agree on something rather than starting conversation. Like I always said it many times on the podcast, let's work on what we agree on. And we developed like a working relation and understanding of each other and some trust maybe even to each other. And then we're going to be in so much better position to work on what divides us rather than we coming cold to the room and just start working on what divides us. That is never going to happen. So that's good to hear. At least there is a somewhere to start on governance. But overall, like, what are the biggest challenges to the reintroductions? Is it what we mentioned earlier, that farmers are in general, in an environment that they feel is volatile, the mistrust? Are there any other word that you would use to encapsulate the challenges to introduction, like the biggest, top two?
Yeah, so I was interested in the same way that I was interested in going beyond just farmers are likely to feel negative about this topic, and I wanted to understand why that was the case. So, for example, the shifting in an unstable policy context post-Brexit. I was also interested in getting their perspectives on this suite of management tools that can be used in other countries to manage coexistence. So the finance, the deterrence, the force, and the enterprise. And overall takeaway from that is that farmers were not particularly keen on most of the methods. So, for example, livestock guardian dogs. To take a step back from that and think about the old military adage that the strategy is for amateurs. The professionals really think about logistics. So, and this is where my perspective of actually running a small farm comes in, because it is one thing to have an academic paper that compares the efficacy of livestock guardian dogs versus livestock guardian llamas versus livestock guardian donkeys. And my immediate thought, and the farmers that I was talking to, their immediate thought was, who's going to walk it? Who's going to feed it? Who's going to pay to feed it? What if it starts killing lambs? And you do have some studies that, particularly in the Alps, a lot of livestock guardian dogs up in the European Alps, they get bored because they're really intelligent animals. They start chasing tourists. They start chasing mountain bikers. They start chasing hunting wildlife. And so that's an example. But with all of these management tools, all of them can work, and they're actually all really important. But what I realized was what they do is that they make farming more labor intensive. So, and farming, the history of agriculture, to generalize 10,000 years of human history, is about making farming more labor efficient, less labor intensive, bigger machines, bigger fields. And we can debate the ins and outs and the good and the bad of all of that. But partly that is because of the pressure, financial pressure of the market that is forcing that at times. And what this does, what these methods do, is they make it more labor intensive. So by having dogs, you have another animal that needs to be managed. Even if you have llamas or donkeys, which are eating grass, just like the sheep they're with, again, it's another species that needs to be managed, needs to be tested, needs to be tagged. If you are running a compensation scheme, which again, really important, or an insurance scheme so that farmers are financially compensated, again, there's going to be a certain amount of administration involved with that. So you're adding you're adding time to busy farmers. And even with the enterprise approaches, these other methods, including force, so that's things like hazing and culling and even removing or translocating problem animals, all of them are about trying to stop bad things happening or minimizing bad things from happening, usually from large carnivores to livestock. But enterprise approaches, that's things like sport hunting, mainly tourism, also certification schemes like a lynx country lamb, for example, where farmers are paid a premium. Those are about seeing the potential for predators in a landscape as opposed to the problems. And I thought farmers are going to be more open to that. But again, some of the perspectives where, well, I know nothing about tourism. I'm not a tourism entrepreneur. That's adding risk to my business. Or one of the comments, I think it's a quote in the report, was, how do you have tourism with a cat that you never see? Which is something I've done a lot of research on in Nepal with snow leopards, which I have still not seen in the wild, by the way. How do you have tourism with a cryptic, elusive cat that you rarely ever see? So again, all of these methods are important. I'm not saying they can't work or that they're denigrating them, but again, we need to think through how they work and could they work, and are there different things that I haven't considered that we should consider? So for example, some of the rewilders talked about with compensation, that a compensation scheme or an insurance scheme where you have to verify every animal and every loss introduces a bureaucracy that just none of us want, never mind farmers who are famously intolerant of bureaucracy. And I've been there myself running a small farm. And they said, what we really need is a proactive environmental performance type payment, where if you have lynx on your land, you get a top up to your subsidy. If you lose livestock, you get a top up to your subsidy. And those are automatic, and it cuts out layers of bureaucracy. And that is certainly, it's not something that really was discussed much in this report. There are less examples of that to consider, but it's something that's worth thinking about more in the coming years and decades.
Well, absolutely. Like you said, this is just adds another headache. Even like with the livestock guardian dogs, like something that I never thought about, but it was brought to my attention not long ago that you need insurance if the dog bites tourists, because tourists want to take a photo with the guardian dog, and the guardian dog, guess what? He's guarding against like this tourist. And then I think it was a case in Italy where the woman get mauled and died by livestock guardian dogs. So the whole insurance headache added to that, right? But you see, you mentioned, I was reading with interest about these 5 tools or this toolkit that you mentioned, and I was thinking, where in that toolkit, or is it something outside of the toolkit, is something that is not by me term is coined, but it's coined like extinction of experience, or just forgotten of an experience of living with these animals on the landscape. I think that especially in the context of Britain and Ireland, this is huge, because we see those things playing out in the EU, where wolves and lynx, wolves mainly, they're spreading because they do what the wolves do, right? And then the discussion is like, well, you see the conflict is much lower in the countries like, for example, Estonia, where I interviewed a lady from Estonia National Animal Group, where the wolves were always there. They kind of always live with the wolves. That experience with how you live with a predator on the landscape was never completely gone. And it was so much easier now to come to the common ground, how to manage wolves. Now, in places like France or Germany, where there was no wolves for decades or centuries, that experience was lost. And it's like, oh, now they're here, like we, shoot them all or whatever else. Now, Ireland and Britain takes that just one notch above, because they will, and that's another something, people who listen to my podcast and on these topics, they already heard those things being said, that someone needs to put that wolf into the crate, do the paperwork, move it, ship it to the island, and cut it out loose there. So if wolf in France kills a sheep or a cow, well, the wolf does what the wolf does. If that happens in Ireland or in Britain, now that is your wolf. That's your fault. You released that wolf.
100%. Yeah.
So is it outside of this tool set? Or is it part of the tool set of getting people, I don't know, it sounds even stupid saying that, accustomed to animal that is not there? Like how, like that tolerance, that's like how to deal with that problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you've hit one of the nails of holding up this whole debate on the head, Tommy, because when we lose the memory of living alongside these animals, and even, for example, in the parts of North America where I was in Wyoming, where wolves have returned. The spread from Yellowstone when they were introduced 20 years ago, and I was there just before they reintroduced wolves to Colorado, and I was talking to people, farmers, ranchers, and there was still some familial memory. There was one family that in the very western part of Wyoming, right on the border with Utah, that I spent time with, and the grandfather, the patriarch of the family, he remembered his father talking about wolves. So there was still some sort of memory of the species in the state. And then secondly, they had coyotes and black bears and mountain lions. So even if that specific species wasn't there, there was an experience of living with large carnivores generally. And as you pointed out, in much of Europe, we lost that completely. We lost the entire large carnivore guild. And apart from pockets like the Apennines in Italy, parts of northern Spain, the Baltics, Eastern Europe, and also Scandinavia, outside of that, there was just a blank on the map where the wild things were, and they were no more. And as these species have, through legal protection and also the commendable efforts of many conservationists over the last couple of decades, have recolonized those spaces, we have had to learn again how to live with this species. And when that happens particularly after long periods of time, and we're talking about in the Netherlands, 200 years, in these islands more, we're getting into millennia. In some cases in Britain, and well, lynx is a whole other question mark entirely that we may or may not get onto in this podcast. It becomes harder still. And then you add another degree of complexity when, as you've pointed out, when we bring them back. When they're not simply, like in the Netherlands, walking across the border from Germany, they can never swim the Irish Sea or jump the English Channel. They can only be brought, but they put them in a crate and bring them from Germany or Estonia or Poland. And that makes it a profoundly social process. Ironically, reintroducing it's something that people do with and for nature, and that makes it cultural and psychological and political. And this is why, for me, and obviously I'm going to say this as an environmental social scientist, but we urgently need more and more of that social science to understand the social process that is reintroducing.
For sure. I was just thinking that social science is way more important than biology and ecology at this point, because the other tools we got like sufficient knowledge, but this is super difficult. So maybe a little bit on that front, like what is your view on the, rewilding projects? I'm making air quotes for people who just listening to that, don't viewing this on YouTube, behind the fence rewilding. Like I was talking about rewilding with specialist scientists, and the takeaway I was like, in the rewilding, always the problem is the fence. Whether the fence is to keep the animals in or keep them out, that's the problem of rewilding. But then there are a lot of projects of rewilding, of bringing the animals in limited numbers and fencing them off or out and so on. What's your take on those? Are they sort of like a good proxy, good idea to start to reintroduce not so much the animal itself, but reintroduce the memory and the consciousness of these animals being there, and maybe go like, it's like, oh, look, this is pretty cool. What are they eating? Oh, they just, is that a good idea? Or do you think that this is, again, quote unquote, vanity projects, and they're cool for education and whatever else, but they of the limited use if we're talking about actually having them on the landscape free roaming?
I'm open to that idea. For me, the problem with these animals, throughout human history, there have been those who feared them, those who worshipped them, those who thought they were the devil incarnate, those who saw them as a deity, and everyone in between. And we still have that broad spectrum of opinions in a landscape. And that is exacerbated by, as we said earlier, the fact that these animals move large distances. And so if you have a landscape in the west of Ireland or the west of Scotland where you bring these animals back, and you have, say, some large landowners, whether private or the state, where these animals can be, the problem is not, and that you have suitable deer densities to match for wolves or for lynx. The problem is not when those animals are on those big parcels of state or private land where everyone's for it. The problem is when they move beyond that into the mosaic of family farms with small to medium scale sheep farms that are struggling to keep the lights on. So if you can find some way of spatially zoning or separating those landscapes so that the reintroduced animals are staying where they're supposed to, and they're not going onto the land of those who do not want them there, I think that is a good thing. And whether that is with a physical fence, such as, for example, the South African model of conservation, where you tend to get a lot of fenced reserves, and then that means it adds complexity because you need to get genetic interchange between populations. You still have to dart them and create them and move an animal like a breeding male or a breeding female to a new area. I think it's something that could be worth considering. And I think this is, and I've pointed out in the report that this is one of the main areas that's not considered. I consider it more in the book, but again, it's passing reference. I just didn't have the space, and I personally don't have the knowledge, is the rapid pace of technological change in right now, as we speak, is such that in the coming years, there may be tools that will allow us to zone landscapes without the need for a hard fence. So I'm talking about things like some version of geofencing for large carnivores and livestock, where, and I'm completely speculating here, you have sensors on or in livestock, you have sensors on or in reintroduced large carnivores, and you have a very powerful, this is your area of expertise, Tommy, more than mine, AI-based system like the Earth Ranger platform, which you might have come across, or some of your listeners might have heard, that is able to manage the data from those sensors, from drones, from fence-based sensors, from camera traps in real time, and allow the effective zoning of the landscape. I think that might be one of the ways that this could be more feasible through something like that. What I feel that then opens up is a whole philosophical can of worms is, are those animals still wild? Is it ethical to put sensors on and in a reintroduced lynx? I asked this question to the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I was spending some time with them, and they're on call 24/7, 365 to respond to incidents with people, predators, and livestock across the state, which is 10,000 kilometers squared, bigger than the island of Ireland, but has a population of 600,000. So a lot of space there. And they're permanently on call, and they respond. Sometimes they have to use force, but they're also training, doing research, education, the whole package. Really great organization there. And part of the reason that they're able to manage the wolf population so effectively and manage the conflicts is that they have a GPS collar on every wolf pack in the state. And they showed me in one of their head offices this screen, and you could see wolf pack here, wolf pack here, wolf pack here. So when there are problems, they know which is the problem pack, within that maybe even the problem animal. And so I said to them, do people complain about that you have a collar on every wolf pack in the state? Is that too much interference? And they said the only people who complain about it are photographers. Well, spoils the image. But Wyoming is, it's a very conservative Mountain West US state. When I asked the same question, and this is the value in asking the same questions to people in different places with different perspectives, I asked the same question to some leading rewilding organization based in the Netherlands. And I was speaking to him because he's their technology lead. So we were talking about Earth Ranger, we were talking about sensors. And he was much less keen because philosophically he said, we're making these animals less wild by tampering or interfering too much. And yet, if that is the price for these animals to return to at least parts of our landscapes and to reduce the risk of having to shoot one because it's repeatedly killing sheep, my personal opinion is that will be a price worth paying. But it's certainly something that needs to be thought through. And I don't know enough about the technology to say that is available now. I suspect not, but I think it may come in the coming years and decades, and it's something that's worth debating and researching and considering more fully.
You touched on a very important thing that we again talked about a few times, which was like, are they wild? Are you taking away from their wildness? We're not gonna get into that because we could spend an entire hour talking about this thing alone. Speaking about the use of force and speaking about the price to pay for having those animals on the landscape. That was one thing that I distinctly remember from the interview with a lady from Estonia, Helen Aruso, her name. She said, I am, as a wolf lover, I don't like the idea there is a quota of wolves, and we agreed how many wolves you can have in Estonia. But if that's the price to pay, then I'm okay with that. And one of the complaints, well, maybe not the complaints, but like a disillusion or surprise was that she said that sometimes you're attacked from the corner you don't expect to be attacked, that they thought that the whole group who organizes and manages wolves as a national animal, that the animal lovers, call them this, again, umbrella term, would be all for it. And they were attacked that why you allowing any of these wolves to be taken out or just, trophy hunted or whatever the narrative of the week is. And I had a similar conversation in the Irish context with a gentleman who, let's say, is very interested in reintroducing wolves or these exploring the ideas. And I said, hey, would you rather not have them in Ireland at all, or would you have them in Ireland and upfront agree the number or the quota? And surprisingly, he couldn't give me an answer, which meant to me that his answer would be like, no, you're not shooting them. What's your takes on that? And was there anything on that front that you would like to share with us on the use of force and being this a price to pay for having the animals in the landscape?
Yeah, it's a really important topic, but it's a really contentious topic that needs to be handled delicately, and it's one that it's almost difficult to have a conversation with, especially, for example, on social media. And these are the sorts of topics, because they are issues of life and death. And any issue of life and death, should we eat meat, should we not, should we trophy hunt animals, should we not, are important because of the ethical implications. So it's important to recognize that. Nevertheless, it's difficult to have a conversation because of the emotion that becomes attached to this issue. And certainly in Europe, I'm thinking of the bear that killed the Italian jogger in northern Italy in particular, or the wolf that killed Ursula von der Leyen's pony. Once you see kill orders being issued for problem animals, and those two are particularly interesting because obviously they made international news and lots of people were jumping on the bandwagon. It became very fraught, lots of pro and against piled in, lots of money piled in, court cases started mounting. But that just shows that this issue is an emotive one. And yet the great high priest of British rewilding, George Monbiot, whose book Feral was one of the inspirations for me really delving into this topic, because a lot of the rewilding books they maybe have a paragraph or a section on large carnivore introductions, but they haven't really delved deeply into the matter of that. But George Monbiot talks in that about, he actually says, although he personally finds it distasteful, that he would be supportive of sport hunting of wolves if they were reintroduced to Britain for a number of reasons, including that it would create in the hunting lobby a powerful group of supporters for their return alongside rewilders and conservationists, but also that it would keep wolves fearful of people and of their farms and farmsteads and where landscapes that people were using more heavily. But also thirdly, and I thought this was really quite important because it came up in my international interviews, is that it allowed a sense of agency for farmers that they felt. And I saw this in Switzerland and I saw it in the Netherlands, less so in the States where firearms are much more readily available. And people said some words to the effect of, we just feel that we're powerless. We feel like we can't do anything about this. The species is legally protected. Our sheep are being killed. The compensation scheme is an absolute disaster bureaucratically. Our way of life is being changed. We just feel powerless. And nobody likes to feel powerless. And George Monbiot, and I would agree with them in this, and my research has confirmed this to me, is that having that option on the table, yes, it needs to be carefully managed, the ethics and all the rest of it, but even having the option on the table, even if it is rarely used, gives a sense of empowerment to those whose livelihoods are going to be affected by the return of these species. And that, again, we're talking about perception and reality here. The perception that that choice is available, even if it isn't used very often or only used in certain scenarios, I think is important to have it there, as challenging as it can be to implement on the ground. And one of the things actually to add to that troubled me, and I see this as a fault line, I don't talk about it in the report, but I do talk about it in the book, is conservationists, which I am one, are very, as opposed to say theoretical ecologists, they're out in the conservationists are out in the field getting their hands dirty and aware that what sounds good in a textbook, once you get down to boots in the ground, you have to make trade-offs and compromises and choices and all of those things. And I think that many are open to, like your Estonian interviewee, they accept that though they do not like it personally, to have a species in a landscape, lethal control and other forms of force, hazing and transfer killing, have to be options that are on the table, even if they're very used in very carefully managed scenarios. So conservationists are usually thinking, because they're willing to compromise, to put the significance of the population or the significance of the ecosystem or landscape above the significance of one individual. So who is willing to sacrifice that individual for the common good of the entire species or the entire landscape or the entire ecosystem. within the animal rights community, that is inverted and flipped. So the individual becomes the most important unit of change beyond the common good. And that's generalizing a lot. But what that means in this debate and what we're talking about, and to go back to Ursula von der Leyen and her pony and the Italian jogger in northern Italy, and also in some of the places that I traveled, is you get animal rights groups coming in and who are just not willing to compromise at all when it comes to lethal control. Even when there are problem animals that are a threat to farmers' livelihoods, they're repeatedly killing sheep, or in the case of the Italian jogger, they're a risk to human life. And they're just not willing to compromise on the issue of lethal control. And there was another quite troubling example when I was in the Netherlands. There was a Dutch farmer he was actually, it was a demonstration farm for deterrence methods. So farmers across the Netherlands came to him to learn how to have wolf-proof fencing. So you need multi-strand electric fencing, has to be a certain height, so many strands of electric wire, really high voltage, so that through all that fur, the wolf gets a good shock and doesn't come back. And other methods. He was like the poster boy for how to farm alongside wolves. And when I was there was a court case where a Dutch animal rights organization sued him because despite all of these methods in place, wolves, it was an area where there were a lot of wolves. This repeatedly killed some of his livestock. And the animal rights organization sued him for not taking enough steps to limit the protection of his livestock. So they were suing him under animal welfare legislation that he wasn't, as a farmer, taking enough steps to safeguard his animal welfare. Now, the judge threw the case out, but I found that quite troubling. And I think in this debate, and we're thinking about this in Ireland and in Britain, we're not just talking about farmers rewilders and reintroducers via sheep farmers. We have to also think about that in the mix. And it makes things pretty complicated. So it adds another layer of complexity to what is already a complex topic.
Complexity. Yes, Jonny, you have no idea how many times the issue of agency came up. For example, in Italy with bears, where those sheep farmers and people who are tending the flocks, they're feeling powerless. And then you have this typical, they value wolves or bears more than us. And that creates this social tension. And from that point, everything can go just down. So maybe a little on that front. Do you, overall, you obviously had many of the conversations with people on both sides. Would you confirm, or maybe how big part of that was that farmers are felt often left out of the conversation? Or which speaks to the powerless things and so on, and from what goes from that is the messaging, or the what conversation, how people who are for rewilding or for reintroduction should be talking about it to not come across as because one of the things is that farmers feels it's easy for you to say we want wolves or we want lynx and so on. You live in a goddamn apartment in a city.
Yes.
Now I am the one who gonna handle the issues. There's disproportional amount of problems are gonna be on one group of it. So, and then on that, it all kind of meshes in what we talked about so far. Then some, and I'm sure you can, it's funny that you mentioned Monbiot, and I don't know whether this is his position still or not, but some people from the rewilding there's many of them, and some of them are high profile. I'm not specifically referring to George now, but they are probably the worst that could happen to rewilding, because they are making this topic toxic. They are making the term being openly confrontational towards farmers. And how, so, this is a very open question, more I'm asking you on elaborate on the whole issue of the conversation and the fact that some rewilding groups feel the right is so much on their side that they're either not willing to compromise, or they're openly going because you done this and that and whatever, and then it just is super difficult to go anywhere with that. How to solve that? How to talk about rewilding?
Yeah, I think we could do a whole podcast series just on that one topic, Tommy.
I'm on.
I'd answer it in 90 seconds. The example from the Irish Examiner op-ed that I wrote recently, which I'd encourage your listeners, and maybe you'd be able to add the link, Tommy, to the show notes.
Absolutely. Links are just for the listeners. Like, links are always in the show notes, and also subscribe to my newsletter. Link is also in the show notes, and in this newsletter, you're always getting way more material and links than only in the podcast. So sorry, I just had to plug in my newsletter here.
What he said, whatever he said. Absolutely. Well, so I give two examples there that are worth reiterating here, and then there's a third one from the Netherlands, a bit closer to home. So one was when I was 11, I moved from rural Monaghan, deepest, darkest rural Ireland, to live in Malawi in Southern Africa. And I'd spent my childhood, I'd lived in Malawi as a small child, but not that I remembered it. So all my experience of wildlife was David Attenborough, a really wild show, devouring my dad's back catalogue of National Geographic. And I went to Malawi and through safaris and national parks, but even on the edges of our city, we had leopards and hyenas breeding and living in the forest reserves. And I began to become aware that I worshipped these animals almost. It was this already at that stage knew this is what I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing. And yet I began to become aware that for communities who are washing their rivers in the River Sherry, or farmers guarding their maize crops or guarding their goat herds, that things like elephants, crocodiles, leopards, these were a threat to their livelihoods and to their lives. And the animals, just like you said with the wolves, the animals are the same. They've been unchanged for millions of years. They just do what they do, and usually very well. But our perspectives were different. And when I went to Nepal, which we started our conversation talking about, there was this snow leopard, this mythic ghost of the mountains that I had spent up to that point. I went to Nepal when I was 25. I'd spent 20 years of my life just waiting to go to Nepal. I'd been there as a tourist, but now I was here as a professional researcher. Didn't see a snow leopard, mind you, but it wasn't just the snow leopard. It was the landscape and the people, this whole package, this romantic package. And yet when I was there, and I was in Nepal just at the end of last year, making a short film about snow leopard conservation. And when I was there, my friend, a Nepali conservationist called Rinzan Lama, who I work with and support, he is a phenomenally talented individual. He got a message on WhatsApp, a different part of the Annapurna area that we were in. And he said, I just got a message, an adult female snow leopard and her 3 adult cubs have broken into a corral and they've killed almost 100 sheep and goats in one night. Now, those incidents are very rare, but they do happen, particularly with cats, because cats get into an enclosed space and they just succumb to this killing frenzy. Instinct takes over. The snow leopard is the same. It's been doing what it's been doing for millions of years. But my perspective is very different from that herder who just lost, or maybe even an entire community who have lost the bulk of their livelihood. So I think in this debate, it is really important to recognize multiple perspectives on this one issue. And that the real conflict is not with the animals themselves, it is with those different perspectives on the animals. And those perspectives are going to be very strongly shaped by whether you live in an urban apartment or whether you're running a small sheep flock of pedigree, rare breed sheep in the mountains of Kerry or Mayo or Argyll or Western Wales or on the edge of Kielder Forest in Northern England. So it's important to recognize that, those multiple perspectives. One is not more important or more valid than the other, but it's important to recognize that we have multiple perspectives. And when it comes to then preparing the ground and researching this topic in depth, there's a really good example to share with you from the Netherlands. And I went to the Netherlands, like Switzerland, they're both about the same size. Both countries are about half the size of Ireland. The Netherlands has 3 times the population of the island of Ireland. So it's very intensively farmed, very densely populated, and yet it has had wolves return. And a coalition of conservation organizations did a fairly good job of preparing the Dutch public for the return of the wolf. And they brought in the hunting organization within like a multi-stakeholder group. They tried very hard to bring in the Dutch Farming Union. They weren't particularly successful, but they did ask. And they also tried to work with government to get the policy and procedures in place. And the government responded with 2 things. they did a huge ecological study of the ecology of wolves recolonizing the Netherlands. And that's obviously really important. It's the bedrock on which this debate hinges, or the foundation anyway. The second weighty tome was legal opinion. So they looked at the legality under European law and Dutch law, and they started to think about in what scenarios would we haze or remove or maybe even shoot a problem wolf. This is from talking to one of the leading wolf ecologists in the Netherlands who's involved in coordinating the conservation of the species in the country. And he said what was completely missing was anything to do with the sociology, the culture, the psychology, the politics, the real nitty-gritty human dimensions of the return of wolves. And lo and behold, 10 years later, where are the real problems arising with wolf recolonization? It's not the ecology and it's not the legality, it's the human dimensions. Because we have multiple perspectives. It's not black and white. It's not we're wrong and they're right, good farmers, bad rewilders, or vice versa. So again, the importance of social science and the humanities to really get to grips with the nuance and complexity of our involvement in this process is absolutely crucial.
100% true. Jonny, to wrap this up, what's your outlook for the future? How do you see the future? Do you think that the momentum is building? Because, I mean, like discussions that we have even right now on this podcast, but in general, in the public space, the discussions about reintroductions, rewilding, we wouldn't have those discussions just 5-10 years ago. So do you think that the momentum is building and this is just a matter of time before it happens? Or maybe that's not such a done deal as some would like to think? If you look at it at 10, 30, 100 years perspectives in your crystal ball, what do you see?
I charge rather a lot for what I read in my crystal ball. It's always just so you know, and it's in the book. I go into this in the book in a lot more detail. It was beyond the scope of the report, which was much more technical and focused. I think momentum is building, and especially there is a national consultation on lynx reintroductions in Scotland happening at the moment. But if you go online and search for it, you will not find a single reference online. It is being done very quietly and very carefully to avoid sensationalizing it, which you can argue that's good, and you could argue a case against it. There is a unrelated but similar informal consultation in the north of England at the moment, which is with lynx reintroductions, that is also taking place. So the process is further along in Britain, and particularly in the north of England into Scotland, than it is in Ireland. So that's the first thing to note on the issue in Ireland. The irony is we had wolves until a lot more recently than the rest of these islands. But wolves bring a whole set of challenges that you don't have with lynx. And there is a question that maybe we don't have time to get into now, a question mark really hanging over whether lynx are truly native to Ireland, and whether a single femur bone from 9,000 years ago is sufficient evidence to justify a reintroduction. Now, absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. And I'm actually about to start writing a paper with a colleague at Queen's University who is a specialist in medieval and early modern literature to look in the records and see, is there any literary evidence of lynx in Ireland? And to bring together the literary evidence from Britain. There's emerging evidence of lynx in early modern literature right through to about 1700, which would add 1,000 years onto their presence in Scotland, which is really interesting. So there's issues that need to be debated and discussed there, for sure. I think what limited ecological evidence we have in Ireland at the moment would suggest, and I'm thinking of Colin Guilfoyle's work, that we just don't have the forest cover and the habitat for lynx, and that probably means for wolves as well. So right now, I think it is extremely challenging. But in terms of that crystal ball and the trajectory of the coming decades, is that we're likely to see systematic change in marginal and upland areas, where partly for climate change reasons and partly for nature restoration, we will see large-scale reforestation and also renewable energy and recreation outcompeting marginal upland sheep farming. And what that is doing is creating the habitat, and as deer populations expand, to fill those forested upland areas, the prey base for both lynx and wolves. So I'm wary of putting a time frame on it, but in 2040, 2050, things may be very different. And add to that is the growing support for rewilding, particularly amongst urban and younger individuals who are going to be the voters and the policy makers in 20 years as well. And the Overton window is what is politically acceptable to a given population at a certain time. And right now, I would suggest in both islands, the Overton window is here, and above the Overton window is lynx reintroductions, and above that is wolf reintroductions. But the Overton window is going to start moving up in those coming decades, and it may so happen that lynx reintroductions fall within that Overton window at the same time as habitat and prey have increased in upland areas. So this is a debate that we'll be having for many years, many decades. And lastly, what that gives us is time to really think through, could this work? How do we manage deterrence and force and enterprise and compensation? How do we solve these issues? What mechanisms do we put in place so that farmers are listened to and their concerns are met, while acknowledging that you can never please everyone all of the time? So we have this time now to really think through, and that is work that I hope to be doing more of in the coming years. But I also don't think that it should be a foregone conclusion. To me, and my involvement in this, as much as I'm passionate about the topic, I still think, for me at least, that I'm not fully convinced that it should happen, nor am I fully convinced that it shouldn't. I don't think that this should be a case of this must happen or this is going to happen. I still think we need to ask, is it the right decision? And is there a risk, and this is really important to finish up, is there a risk in reintroducing lynx and wolves that we cause such social conflict over it that it reduces the overall support for, one, nature conservation, and two, environmental sustainability? We cannot jeopardize that much bigger trajectory that we need to safeguard life on planet Earth and on this island that we call home and love so much. So we need to have that debate, and I think now is a good time to start.
I couldn't agree more with your point of potential impact on nature conservation in general by alienating and dividing, farmers, people who live on the land. I think that's an expression you use in the report, people who live on the land or close to the land, and the rest of the populace, or at least conservation NGOs and conservationists. Jonny, that's been excellent. I learned a lot. Our listeners and viewers learned a lot. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Tommy. It's been a pleasure.